Hello, everybody. Welcome from very bonny Scotland. I'm visiting my charming mother-in-law up here, and within about um, 400 yards of where we are at the moment, there's an Italian restaurant. And in the papers today, there's a story about how Italian restaurants are running out of Italian waiters because now we've had Brexit. They need to earn £38,000 to get a visa, and that just about says everything you need to know about Brexit. It's the kind of thing I would have been reporting on in about the 30 years I spent at the BBC. And I'm now Brexit editor at the New European. So I probably will be reporting on it for them. Do please buy the New European. It's, as we say, it's available in all good Waitroses. And it's a very good read. And basically, it's a Remain publication with some very, very good writers, including Paul Mason and Alistair Campbell and Patience Wheatcroft, and quite a few others. And we try and hold the government to account on certain things. Now, just getting back to the Italian restaurant, it's just one of the own goals of Brexit. That it wasn't just important that restaurants in Scotland could have Italians come and work here. There's a long tradition of very poor Italians coming to Scotland, setting up originally fish and chip shops and gelaterias, and then moving into making Italian food. And you won't get a bad Italian meal in Scotland because that tradition goes back at least 100 years. And they were still and still are bringing over people from Italy to work in those restaurants. You get real cousins and nephews and grandsons coming over. And for them, it wasn't just a job in the UK. It was a chance to learn English, make contacts, go back with some skills and some earnings. So it was a kind of Erasmus scheme for the restaurant trade. Erasmus is the scheme which allows EU nationals at university to spend a term in another country studying, learning the language, learning the culture, and so on. And it's one of the things that the UK left when we left Brexit. We were offered the chance to stay in it, and basically they said, "Oh no, we don't want those nasty Europeans corrupting our university students by teaching them foreign languages or anything like that. We're going to leave," which was basically the attitude of the Brexiteers, which we want nothing whatsoever to do with the EU. And very nearly the same thing happened with Horizon, which was the cooperation between academics at universities, which was encouraged by the EU and was a huge success. And we got locked out of that because we refused to implement the trade agreement we had negotiated, or Lord Frost had negotiated on our behalf. And we were only let in after the Windsor framework was announced, which dealt with the problems of Northern Ireland. But that leads me to the title of this little talk, which was Brexit, What Rejoiners Know and Brexiteers Don't, which reminds me about, many of you will know this, there used to be a political party in America in the 19th century called the NoNothings. And their full name, their proper name was actually the American Party, but they were called the NoNothings because they were so secretive that if anyone asked them about it, members were told to say that they knew nothing about it at all. And the reason they were so secretive was because actually they were sectarian, xenophobic, anti-immigration, populist, conspiracy theorist-loving loons. And if that reminds you of anyone in our time, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. The NoNothings lasted about 2 years. Unfortunately, here the Brexiteers have lasted considerably longer than that, about 30 years. They started in about the 80s, 40 years, started in about the 80s. Now it's in the 2020s. And they've done far more damage than the NoNothings ever did in America. So let's get to the details of what we know. I'm going to start talking about what we as Remainers know, and then I'll move on to actually, which is probably a more interesting bit, is what the Brexiteers don't know, or what they claim they don't know, because it's becoming increasingly obvious that quite a few Brexiteers do know or suspect that things are going very wrong, but they just can't admit it. First, we Remainers, we know that it's been a disaster. We said it was going to be a disaster, and it has been a disaster. Almost everything that was said by the Remain camp during the campaign and since has come true, except for one very stupid claim by George Osborne when he was panicking at the polls just before the referendum was held, and said that it would immediately plunge us into a recession. Nobody else thought that. That's not how these things work. It's a kind of slow moving disaster, not a train crash. And basically, George Osborne should have known better. He should have actually stopped David Cameron from having the referendum in the first place, because we didn't need to have one. It was purely part of an internal Tory civil war, and we'll come back to that a bit later. Instead, what happened is we know that we've lost between 4 and 6% of our GDP over it'll take about 8 to 10 years to fully work its way out, which doesn't sound like much, but that's 0.5% in a year, maybe. And when this year we'll be lucky if the British economy grows by 1%, we'll be very lucky if it grows by 1%. That basically means we've lost between a third and a half of our growth this year, and probably next year as well. And 0.5% is a significant proportion of our growth rate, and we desperately need a growth rate because we're running out of money, and there's lots of things we need to have an expanding economy to pay for. That's 4 to 6%, just to put it in context for you, is enough for us to treble or quadruple the defence budget without even noticing. That's how much we've lost because of this. Or we could increase spending on the NHS by about 50%. So that's the kind of the cost, economically speaking. Then, of course, there's things like regulatory divergence, which is a continuing problem for the UK economy. There's something called divergence by inertia, which I came across when I was talking to a business group quite recently, which basically means if the British government doesn't introduce laws to keep us in touch with the EU rules, we gradually spread apart. Not by an active policy of actually changing our rules, but just because the EU rules are changing all the time, and therefore we are, if we don't do anything to keep in touch with them, we will drift apart. Now, and if you're interested in this, there's a very good survey or analysis done by UKIS, which is the UK in a Changing Europe, which is a think tank made up of lots of economists and political experts and so on. It's very good, and it does something called the Divergence Tracker, and it publishes about once every 3 months. And what it shows is areas where we have diverged from the EU and it's costing us money, areas where we've diverged from the EU and we're making money, and that's a very small group. And then the third one is areas where we're desperately trying to stay in touch with the EU rules and regulations because we know it would be a disaster if we changed. And as the report's author said last week in the latest one, which I did report for the New European, he said, Joel Relland, his name is, he said, and this is quotes, "The UK is living next door to a regulatory behemoth, which it cannot afford to ignore. Even after Brexit, the EU remains the UK's chief export market, so British businesses have little choice but to conform with new EU regulations. The main difference is that now the UK government has no means of influencing EU policy decisions from the inside." And that's basically the situation we have put ourselves in. And then you get the Brexiteers who say, yes, but we were shackled to a corpse. The EU growth is terrible. We want to be part of a wider international trading group. We want to be doing business in the Pacific region and so on. And then you look at what's really happening, and our trade with China is down 5% this year. And it's down 5% because basically during COVID, we all discovered that we had very long supply chains and we didn't trust the Chinese, and they are not very nice people and they don't have our interests at heart. And we better bring some of it back. And so we are doing something called reshoring, which is instead of offshoring, which is sending your manufacturing to China or Vietnam or whatever, we're bringing some of it back. There are many factors that are influencing that, but we're also doing something called nearshoring and friendshoring, which is you don't bring it back to the UK, you put it somewhere cheap, but you put it somewhere cheap that's much closer to the UK than China, or you put it in a country which you really trust and like and you get on with, which is basically for us the EU. So our trade with China is declining just at the time when the Brexiteers told us that was the bright new future, which is proving to be a real problem for the British economy. I won't go through all the things that I think I spoke to you last time about, things like the CE mark, which is on everything from your toothbrush to your television and your mobile phone to your bike. Basically says that it conforms to EU standards and can be sold anywhere in the European Economic Area. We wanted to diverge from that. Everyone said it was mad. It just involved testing everything twice. It didn't have any benefits. The government backed down. The same for chemicals. They've had to delay it. And then the food import checks, which we have delayed 6 times, I think, were due to come in the day we left the EU. and they're coming in at the end of this month. And the calculations are that that's going to add £1 billion a year to food costs. It was famously called an act of economic self-harm by someone called Jacob Rees-Mogg when he delayed it for the 5th or 6th time. And that hasn't changed. It's economic self-harm. And we know what is likely to happen because the EU did introduce tests on agricultural and food imports into the EU from Great Britain when we left. And the consequence was that lots and lots of SMEs just stopped exporting food. And lots of them just closed up business, or they just concentrated on the UK. And we expect the same to happen now. Lots of small EU companies that sell in UK and have a niche market will just stop. And the big companies will be fine because they can afford the added costs and the red tape and the staff they have to employ to do all that. But we'll lose out on a lot of trade. So it's just another ratchet up of the pressures on the UK economy caused by Brexit. Another is farming subsidies. We've had protests by farmers. They're getting noisier and noisier because although they were promised, I mean, the farmers voted for Brexit in the same proportion as the general population, about 52–48%. But of course, it was an act of great ingratitude because farmers had had their mouths stuffed with gold by the EU for decades. And they complained that they weren't getting enough money and there was too much red tape involved in getting subsidies. And so they were told that there'd be less red tape and more subsidies. Well, unfortunately, there's more red tape and fewer subsidies. We all knew that was going to happen because the Treasury looked at it and said, why are we paying these farmers so much money? And so they stopped. And so the farmers are being screwed. Fishing industry is being screwed. We all know that. Those are the things we know about Brexit and the economics of Brexit, which is my particular area. But I do have a degree in international relations. So actually, I'm quite interested in political, diplomatic consequences as well. And it is obvious that we have lost a lot of reach and heft and influence in the world permanently and irreversibly. There was a report into the Foreign Office by lots of former diplomats and senior mandarins just last week, which basically said the Foreign Office needs to be much less imperial, move out of its massive headquarters into a newer building, take down some of its musty old pictures of, British soldiers forming a square in Sudan or South Africa or wherever it was, and realise that they're a reasonably sized country on the edge of Europe, and that we're not a major power and we should stop pretending we are. And there was a lot of controversy about that, or controversy, but actually it was fairly accurate. We used to be the bridge between Washington and the EU. That gave us quite a lot of influence, not as much as everybody said it did, but we were important, and that's just been removed. The Americans have no reason to come to us to try and get things done in Europe. Maybe through NATO they do, but not economically or generally in a political sense. They now go to France or to Germany if they want to make a bridge into Europe. So we've lost influence in Washington and around the world, and reputationally speaking, we're a laughingstock. If you read German newspapers, French newspapers, Australian, American newspapers, they are just staggered. They just think it's a joke. So, for instance, the trade deals we did with Australia and New Zealand, there was actually a New Zealand news report about which they just laughed. They just said, "Why have they given this deal? It's so much better for us than it is for them. Why are we doing this?" And so we have become a laughingstock. Now let's move on to the Brexiteers. What do they know and what do they not know? It was rather difficult to tell. The vast majority of them still don't know what's really going on because they read newspapers that feed them lies, and the government feeds them lies, and they are the lies they want to believe. So they do believe them. But the interesting thing is how desperate those lies are getting and how ridiculous the claims are getting. So, for instance, we've had the business secretary announce trade deals, so-called trade deals in quotes there, with places like Texas and North Dakota and Florida. Well, it will come as no surprise to you that, funnily enough, Texas and Florida and North Dakota aren't allowed to sign trade deals because of a little thing called the American Civil War, which was a war which was basically fought between federal troops who believed that America was one country and Washington was the government, and the Confederalists, who believed that each state was an independent country and can do as it wants. And the Federalists won. And states are not allowed to make foreign treaties. And so if you look at this so-called trade deal, which are actually memorandums of understanding, which are nice bits of paper, if you look at about page 46, there is a nice paragraph. This is the Texas one, which I read recently. There's a nice little paragraph that says, this is not a legally binding document. This is not an international treaty. It is not enforceable in law. It has no legal status. Only deals approved by the Washington government have that status. So basically, within what the Department for Business is calling a trade deal is a paragraph that says this isn't a trade deal. That shows how desperate they are. They then talk about us joining the Pacific Trade Area. I've told you about our trade with China declining. That trade deal is expected to add 0.008% to the British economy over 10 years. That's so small you couldn't possibly measure it. It's just it's well within the margin of error. I mean, even if it was 10 times larger than that, it would still be within the margin of error of GDP calculations. So that's a bit of a con. And we also know that, by the way, when we do that calculation of, Brexit's going to cost us 4%, that's all the benefits of Brexit minus all the costs. And that trade deal is in that calculation. So it's not, it was 4% and now it's slightly less because we've got a trade deal with the Pacific. It's still 4% because that's in the calculations already. And so, for instance, I had to write something about, I was still investigating it actually. There was a piece in the Daily Mail, a front page story in the Daily Mail last week saying, all the Remainers are wrong. Britain is the 4th largest exporter in the world, say new figures from the UNCTAD, which is UNCTAD, United Nations Convention on Trade and Development, I think. Anyway, I thought this must be total tosh, so I contacted the UN, and they're still looking for the figures because they say it didn't come from us. And I'm saying, well, the Daily Mail says it does. And he says, no, this is rubbish. We didn't tell them that. So we still don't know who told them this rubbish, but they put it on their front page. And then today, I've just been sent another story by my editor at the New European from the Sunday Mail saying the NHS has had far more money from the government than the £350 million lie on the side of that bus during the referendum. And therefore, we owe the Brexit campaign an apology. And you kind of go, but I've read the article, and there's no connection between the money we've saved from our EU contributions and money that's gone to the NHS. It's just complete disconnect. We put more money into the NHS every year. The Tory government has not put as much as is necessary into the NHS, and none of it has come from Brexit. In fact, because the economy is smaller than it should be, or would have been, we know it's actually made it more difficult to fund the NHS, not easier. And then there was an article which I did have to have a go at by another Brexiteer who said trade has soared because of Brexit. And she was the person who wrote this was from an organisation called Economists for Brexit, which kind of gives the game away about where they're coming from. And I read that, and I read the whole report, and it turned out she'd forgot to take inflation into account. So if prices go up by 20%, the value of your exports go up by 20%, and we've had lots of inflation. So any sensible economist takes inflation out of the figures, and that shows that our trade is about 17% lower than it would have been if it had continued the trend before Brexit. So, but most interestingly was a report by someone called Cheryl Jacobs in the Telegraph, who basically a couple of weeks ago said Brexit isn't working, and that means we should rejoin. And that was from a Brexit supporting commentator. And I thought that one was really interesting. Now, part of her argument was complete tosh. She said Brexit has failed because of the courts and the Guardian readers and the blob and the woke civil service and failure to take advantage of everything, all of which is tosh. But the conclusion was, if we're not going to do it properly, we may as well rejoin the EU. And I thought that was a real sea change from a commentator. And you do begin to see that in, if you, like me, drag yourself through the Telegraph opinion pages occasionally, reading Lord Hannon and quite a few other people who I don't have very much time for. They're basically coming to the conclusion it hasn't worked like we thought it would. That's because we've been portrayed, but maybe the solution is to have a closer deal with the EU. Now, that's the kind of commentators, the journalists who do actually know things. And I'm always cynical about them because these are people who were Marxists when Margaret Thatcher was in power, and then Thatcherites when Labour were in power, and then Remainers, and then they move with the the zeitgeist, and they always like to be, but they always like to be slightly ahead of it. They like to be contrarian. So some of them are now coming around to saying Brexit isn't working. This means that there's going to be a desperate fight in the Tory party and Remain for, I think, the soul of Brexit, and it will probably come after the election. It's also why we see these Brexiteers going on about the European Convention for Human Rights so much, because it's got the word Europe in it. It's another reason why we haven't totally broken free. It's another excuse for a battle about sovereignty and all these other issues which they don't really understand. And Brexiteers have been completely irresponsible about this. Irresponsible because the European Convention for Human Rights is written into the Good Friday Agreement. You tear it up and the Good Friday Agreement dies. It would also shatter our relationship with the EU in many other ways. So there would be no police cooperation, there would be no data transfers, there would be no trust whatsoever. If the EU wanted to, they could basically put tariffs on us. I don't think they would go that far, but they could basically tear up the TCA. They basically turn it, no, membership of the European Convention was an integral part of that deal. You've taken us out, the deal's dead. And we would be in serious problem. We'd be going back on our knees to beg them to have us back after a while. But for the Brexiteers, it would be that complete schism with the EU that they've always wanted. There's another issue of that, which is it's obviously an attempt to poison the well for Labour if they leave and then fight a campaign on, we are truly independent and our courts are now sovereign and so on. Makes it rather difficult for Labour, but we would have to rejoin. And it all comes down to this, really, that they know I think Brexiteers know deep down it's been a failure. That's why the commentariat is slowly changing course, as it always does. It smells the mood, and the politics is following that mood. For the ultras, the Reform Party, the nutters, the racists, the bigots, the European Research Group in the Tory party and the other groups, there's 5 of them, I think 5 different families of jingoists and fools, they're going to be fighting like rats in a sack. They're going to scream betrayal and treason after the next election. The second Labour get in, they will almost undoubtedly ask Brussels. They won't try and rejoin the single market or the customs union. They'll just try and make the deal a bit better. Maybe an agreement on veterinary and health standards, so we don't need these checks at the borders. Join the CE mark again, and just say we'll stay in lockstep with you on regulations like that and things like that. That means that Reform and the others will fight to the death against this. And the civil war in the Tory party is going to break out into the open. There is going to be a battle for survival. Basically, the winner will be the one that keeps the name the Conservative Party. The Brexiteers are already complaining that the One Nation Tories are being parachuted into constituencies by Conservative Central Office, ignoring the fact that the One Nation Tories were basically thrown out by the Brexiteers when they took over the party. So why they think they're being parachuted in, I don't know. But it's basically the Tory party members have been UKIPers for years, and they don't like what they see as, a lot of them are saying, oh, the current government is socialist. It's hard to believe, but they really think that. And they've taken over the party at the grassroots. They don't quite have a majority of party in the Commons, but they might well do after the next election. They're going to fight to take over the Tory party, and if not, they'll basically join up with Reform. This comes back to what my brother famously blamed all this on John Major, and that if he kicked out 5 or 6 members of the cabinet in 1993 or whatever it was, we wouldn't have had any of this problem. But the Civil War is going to break out. And so we're going to basically end up with a Reform Brexiteer, jingoistic, racist party, probably calling itself the Tory party, or if not, Reform or something like that. I've no idea who's going to win, but I think the membership probably supports the Reform side of the party. And I think that means that the Conservatives are going to split and they're going to be out of power for a very long time. And that is basically why I think that they know they're going to lose. They know economically they've lost. They can write rubbish articles saying, we're actually better off. Everyone knows we're worse off. All the independent research is very, very clear. We are much worse off. We are less powerful. We're less influential. Our farming has been ruined, is being screwed. Our fishermen are suffering terribly. Manufacturers are furious. Investment is down. Inward investment into the UK is down. Nobody is taking us seriously. We cancelled HS2. We look like idiots. Nothing works. We need a new start. So I think I'll confidently say this: in 20 years' time, all of this will be history, but we'll still be paying for the stupidity and the lack of knowledge of the Brexiteers, because they just didn't know anything, and their ignorance was deadly. But just like in America, the know-nothings are doomed. It'll take a lot longer for us to get rid of them than it did for America to get rid of the know-nothings in the 19th century. It took them about 3 years. But in a sense, there's going to be a D-Day when it comes to Brexit. We are either going to have to make, as we did in Normandy in 1944, an attempt to get back into Europe on some level. Maybe not single market, maybe not the customs union, but a much closer, a much more integrated, a much more rational and polite and nice and conversational way of doing business with our friends and colleagues on the continent, because that's the only alternative. And the Remainers and the far-right Tory party can have their civil war and fight to the death over, like the big enders and the small enders in Gulliver's Travels. They can fight to the death over everything they want to. And I think we will get to a stage where we will ignore them and they will sit in a corner like they used to, the swivel-eyed loons, and we will quietly let them get on with it while we try and fix everything that they've ruined for the last 8 years. So there you go. D-Day is coming. We are probably going to get closer to Europe and move back if Labour win this election in a slow and controlled way. And we will just have to learn to ignore the screams of treason and betrayal from the Brexiteers.